Eberron, The City of Towers, The Dreaming Dark, Book 1. Prologue, Seer Kelden Ridge. There was a moment when they might have won the battle. The Sharn troops were seasoned veterans, though they had little choice in the matter. In these troubled times, a man became a soldier the moment he was old enough to wield a scythe or a flail. The troop had been taken by surprise, but within moments of the initial assault, the Sharns had formed ranks and were holding their own. A roll of thunder heralded the arrival of the stormship. Then terror dropped from the night sky. Painted black, the sleek longboat herself was almost invisible from the ground, but the lightning flashing around the ring of elemental air holding the ship aloft flickered off the bottoms of the clouds, painting the battlefield in bright light and black shadows. Within moments, a wave of arrows rained down upon the Sharn army. Fiery explosions rocked the battlefield. Hundreds died, and the tide of battle altered. Dane swore as he strode into the ruined camp, cursing Flame and Sovereign alike. Behind him, the warforged Pierce surveyed the carnage. 2 arrows held to his massive longbow. Jode examined the bodies of the fallen, but the halfling's healing touch could not raise the dead. "Serath!" Dane shouted. "Serath! If you're already dead, I swear I'll find a path to Dolur so I can torture you for eternity." A pale face peered around the open flap of a singed tent. "But Captain," the balding half-elf whimpered, his face pale, "it's an ambush. There are enemies all around. No, I'm not supposed to place myself at risk." Dane reached inside the tent, grabbed the collar of Serath's robe in one mailed fist, and hauled the wizard forward and almost off his feet. Though slightly built, Dane was surprisingly strong. "Damn the Queen's rules, Serath! 10 more minutes, and there won't be an army left, and that includes you." He released his grip, and the portly half-elf staggered back a few steps. As if in answer to his words, a massive ball of flame came whirling out of the sky. Striking 40 feet to their left, the explosion filled the night with the smell of burning flesh and the screams of men and horses. Dane pointed at the stormship as it swept overhead. "We'll serve as your shields, but I need that ship down now. Rules of war or no. If you don't help, I'll kill you myself." As if to put Dane's vow to the test, an enemy soldier emerged from the smoke and into the flickering light of the burning tents. It was a creature out of an artificer's nightmare. Metal, dark wood, and leather merged into a human shape. Its mouth was filled with daggers, and its metal torso was studded with shards of sharpened steel. With every motion, the spikes scraped against its joints, generating a painful whine. The warforged soldier held a gory morning star in each hand, and seeing Dane's badge of office, it raised its bloody weapons and charged. It never reached him. From his right, a silver blur flew forward. Pierce, his own warforged companion. Pierce crashed into the larger warrior and knocked it flat on its back. Dane stayed with the wizard while Jode and Lena raced to help Pierce. But even from the ground, the warforged was a deadly opponent. With one swift motion, it hurled a morning star into Lena's chest, tearing flesh and crushing bone. Before Pierce and Jode could respond, the armored beast rose to its feet, and battle was adjoined in earnest. Sparks flew as the 2 warforged rained blows on one another. As Lena's life ebbed into the dirt, Dane looked back at the cowering wizard. "Now, Serath! The ship's making another pass. and this may be the last chance we have." Trembling, the wizard looked up at the approaching storm. He wove mystical patterns with shaking fingers, whispering words of unbinding and dismissal. As he finished the incantation, a ball of flame fell from the sky, struck, and the world disappeared into fire. Lay saw the fireball strike the center of the camp, and she wondered if Serath had been caught in the blast. Alive or dead, he'd accomplished his task. As powerful as the storm ship was, it relied on a web of delicate enchantments, and the abjurer had managed to disrupt this tapestry of spells. The ring of storm clouds wrapped around the waist of the ship buckled. Bereft of its elemental propulsion, the ship plummeted toward the ground. The disruption was temporary, but it lasted long enough. The stricken storm ship had come crashing down, timber and bodies scattering across the Sharn camp. There was a gust of hurricane wind as the elemental was released from its bonds, and lay staggered against the gale. But even as a ragged cheer went up from the Sharn survivors, a second wave of Warforged emerged from the night. Two of the enemy soldiers, a massive warrior with a long cleaver fused to one arm, and a smaller scout with a dagger in each hand, reached Lay's position. Like Serath, Lay was a non-combatant. As a member of House Cannith, she maintained the Warforged and other magical weapons that the Sharn army had purchased from her house. According to the rules of war, she was a forbidden target, and likewise, she was not allowed to participate in any violence. But the enemy wasn't playing by the rules. Paralyzed with fear and surprise, Lay just watched as the soldier raised its razored arm. Having worked with Warforged all her life, it seemed impossible that she would die this way. She saw her reflection in the blades as it fell toward her face. But at the last moment, she was shoved aside by a small figure. Joleg, the goblin scout. Behind him, Kadrian, Donnell, and Mal moved in to engage the Warforged with their halberds. Joleg grinned at her, even as he darted back in to stab at the construct's leathery guts with his curved blade. He dodged a cleaver blow that would have removed his head, then made a quick thrust at the knee of the armored giant. Lay had never seen Warforged like these before. Despite their heavy armor, these forged moved with an unnatural speed, as they had strangely diverse set of weapons and designs. "Get out of here, Lady Lay," Kadrian shouted. "We'll—" His order was cut short as the Warforge's cleaver sheared through his helmet and split his skull. Mal was next to fall, and as Lay saw his blood dripping from the blades of the Warforged, something inside Lay snapped. Almost without thinking, she walked up to the massive construct. Ducking under a blow intended for Joleg, she reached out and placed her hand on the Warforge's chest. She concentrated, and time seemed to recede as her senses expanded. She could feel the layers of magic binding the myriad components of the Warforged together, the mystical energies that gave the creature thought and emotion. Since she was a child, she had been taught to weave these webs, to create magical artifacts, and bring life to the lifeless. Now, with Kadrian's ruined face fixed in her mind, she hardened her thoughts into a blade and struck at the glowing core of the mystic web. There was a moment of timeless discontinuity, and then she was back in the battle. As she removed her hand, the Warforged soldier simply fell apart, collapsing into a heap of metal and stone. Although the giant was down, the smaller Warforged scout was still on its feet, still covered with the blood of her friends. It danced straight for her like a ghastly silver puppet. There was a flash and a warm sensation across her belly, and she found herself falling to the ground. As the fires and the sounds of war grew faint, She was vaguely aware of a new group of people arriving on the scene of the tiny construct being overwhelmed and shattered. But it was all so far away. A cooling sensation filled her, icy water running through her veins. The world snapped back into clear focus. Jode was kneeling over her, the dragon mark on his head glowing with a pale blue light. "I've got you, Lay," the halfling healer murmured. "Just relax." She closed her eyes and let the soothing light flow through her. Dane looked over from the shattered ruin that had been a warforged soldier. "I need her on her feet," he said. "Now." Pierce is almost in pieces. He scowled and looked out over the battlefield. Burnt corpses were mingled with the twisted remnants of warforged soldiers. We don't even know which side those forged were fighting for. We need to regroup as quickly as possible. Warforged, a bloody storm ship. Who knows what else is out there? As if in answer to his words, the third wave appeared. Chapter 1. Brilland Sharn. Flickering flames cast long shadows, but this was no battlefield. The fire blazed in a beautiful hearth of blue marble, filling the chamber with the rich smell of cedar. This was the home of Lord Hadran Decanith, and the trappings spoke of his wealth and power. The floors were covered with soft sarlonan carpets, each one embroidered with a labyrinthine pattern of twisting, thorny angles. Portraits and glamour-weaved tapestries adorned the walls, depicting the glorious deeds of his Canith ancestors. Dominating the room was a vast, dark wood desk, its surface covered in golden sigils that glittered in the firelight. Lord Hadran Decanith sat behind the desk, pulling at his chin as he listened to the messenger's report. It had been over a year since the Battle of Kelden Ridge and the devastation that had wiped Seer from the pages of history. Over a year since he had heard anything of his betrothed. Hadran was a wealthy and influential man, and he had spent a fortune on inquisitives, messengers, and diviners. Although he feared the worst, he had always clung to an ember of hope, and now, it seemed, his prayers had been answered. "Lay was injured at Kelden Ridge, Lord Hadran," the inquisitive said. She wore a long cloak of dark green leather, a hood pulled low over her face. "It has been difficult to gather any sort of information about the battle, but it seems her troop was faced with an overwhelming force of unknown nationality. They were driven west into contested lands between Thrain and Brilland, and that's the only reason Lay is still alive. On the day of mourning, she was just outside Seer, just beyond the effects of the disaster. I imagine she's one of the few people who actually saw the mourning with her own eyes." "But she's alive. You're sure of it?" Hadran chewed on his gray mustache, a habit his first wife had always despised. "Why didn't she arrive months ago? Why hasn't she sent a message through the stones?" "I'm not a diviner, my lord," the messenger replied, pulling her emerald cloak tight around her body. "I believe her companions took her back into the ruins of Seer to search for other survivors. As for the stones, I wouldn't be surprised if she had no coin, but I know for a fact that Lady Canith is alive and on her way here. I expect she and her companions will arrive in Sharn within the week." "This is glorious news," Hadran cried, jumping to his feet. He found that he was shaking. I know you can't rely on such things, but Months ago, I spoke to an augur about Lay. She said we would never be married, that death would come between us. I prayed and I prayed that it was a false vision. And oh, Olandra, be praised it was. He moved to embrace the messenger, but the Cloak Inquisitive took a step back. Be careful, Lord Hadran, the messenger said, her voice seeming deeper and darker. It is all too easy to misread the prophecy. I said that your betrothed was coming to Sharn. I never said you would see her again. What? Said Hadran, his joy turning to anger. Your oracle said that death would come between you and Lay. The shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, and beneath the hood, the messenger's face was lost in darkness. You assumed the death was hers. She threw off her cloak, and Hadran cried out in horror. Moments later, the messenger wiped her bloody hands on Hadran's shirt. She picked up her cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling the hood down over her head. She took one last look at the ruin that had once been a dragon-marked lord. I'll give your love to Lay, Lord Hadran, she purred. I have great things planned for her. Great things. Chapter 2. Breland, the Old Road. Dane woke in the mud. Cold rain fell from the gray sky, and his woolen blanket was soaked and filthy. At least, it's just water, he thought, compared to what they'd been in over the last 6 months. Rain was a welcome change of pace. The memories came unbidden to his mind, images far worse than any nightmare. For centuries, Seer had been a jewel in the crown of Galifar, a fertile land renowned for its crafts and culture. Now, Seer was a barren wasteland filled with corpses. As he traveled south, Dane heard the peasants whispering about the horrors to be found in this so-called Morn land. According to the tales, blood fell from the sky instead of rain, and the spirits of the dead howled with the wind. The truth was far worse. The battle at Kelden Ridge happened the night before the morning. The final hours of the battle were a blur. None of the survivors could remember how they escaped from the Warforged marauders, and no one could actually recall when the disaster took place. How did it happen? What force could have devastated an entire country, yet leave a few soldiers completely unharmed, a mere 20 feet from the border? Perhaps this amnesia was a side effect of the force that destroyed the realm, or perhaps the event was simply more than the human mind could bear. On that terrible morning, Dane had led the remnants of his troop back to Seer, passing through the dead gray mists to see what lay beyond. How could they have known how vast the devastation could be? Who would believe that an entire country could be destroyed in so brief a time? For months, they had pressed deeper and deeper into the wastes. All they found was horror and death. As the weeks went by, Dane's soldiers fell one by one to the terrors of the Twisted Land, and only 5 survived the long trek back to the border. Dane, Pierce, Yanni O'Neill, the healer Jode, and Lay DeCannith. But that was far from the end of their troubles. Every day brought a new clash with the soldiers of Thrain, and Yanni fell victim to a last gift of Seer, a lingering infection Jode's touch could not cure. Finally, they moved south into Breland. After a few skirmishes, the active aggression of the Brelish soldiers faded into muted disgust. The destruction of Seer had thrown the entire world into a state of shock, and the common folk were weary of war. The chronicler said that King Boronel of Breland had offered sanctuary to the refugees of Seer. Others claimed that princes and ambassadors were hammering out the terms of peace far to the north, laying the foundation of a new world that would take the place of the ancient kingdom of Galifar. The frontier garrisons held the borders against any signs of treachery, and Dane's troop had received a bloody welcome in Thrain. But further south, the people had begun to lay down their swords and return to their plows. After years of battle, it seemed that the conscripts were returning home for good. It had been many years since Dane had a place to call home. Any past he might have returned to was buried in the ashes of Seer. Pierce had been built to fight in a war that was all but over. Jode had never spoken of his family. Lay was the only one of the survivors whose future was clear, and so the others traveled with her on the road to Sharn, not because the city had any particular promise for them, but they had no place else to go. Dane rose and shook the water out his blanket. Pierce was struggling to keep the fire alive, and Lay was starting to break camp, gathering the tarps and blankets. Dane joined her. "Another fine day, he said, handing over his blanket. Lay smiled and shook her head. Her hair was covered with mud, but it seemed to gleam in the firelight, as if there was true copper mixed in with the red. Folding his blanket and placing it with the others, she produced the wooden rod she used as a focus for simple magic. With a few deft gestures, she wove a domestic cantrip into the wood. A wave of this makeshift wand drove mud and water from blankets and clothes and scoured the dirt from her hair and skin. A dry blanket was hardly the most important thing in life, but without Lay's magic, their clothes would have rotted away months ago, and her ability to conjure food was all that stood between the soldiers and starvation. "We're almost there," Lay said, handing him a mug of water and a plate of cold gruel. It was about as pleasant as eating mud, but it had them alive. "If it wasn't raining, you could see the towers from here." "You're really going to go through with this?" "Of course. You don't understand our ways, Dane. I am heir to the Mark of Making, and I have a responsibility to my house." Dragon marks. Dane swallowed a spoonful of gruel with a grimace. No one was born with a dragon mark, but members of a select few bloodlines carried the potential to manifest a mark and the magical power that came with it. It was Jode's dragon mark that allowed him to heal injuries with a touch. Lay's mark had a similar effect, but where Jode could knit flesh and bone, Lay repaired metal and wood. The powers of her dragon mark were the least of Lay's talents, but the mark defined her place in the world. In an age ravaged by war, a weaponsmith could hold more power than a king, and the dragon-marked artificers of House Cannith were the greatest weaponsmiths of modern times. House Cannith blazed the trail that led to the invention of the stormship, the wand of eternal fire, and of course, the Warforged. Dragon marks were rare even within the families that carried them, and Cannith often formed matches between the dragon-marked in the hopes that children would inherit the powers of their parents. So it was with Lay and her betrothed. Hadran de Canith was a widower, and almost twice Lay's age. But his gold was good, and his mark was strong. Blood above love, said Dane. I've heard it before. All I'm interested is in the gold you promised us. It's just, I've seen you covered in mud and blood. I have a harder time seeing you as a lady of the manor. You think I like sleeping in ditches and watching my friends die? Said Lay as she handed a plate of gruel to the groggy Jode. None of us like it, but it's those who can do it without letting it kill them that make soldiers. You lived through things that killed hardened veterans. You're one of us. Lay shook her head. My service in the guard was duty to my family, just as my marriage is. Of the two, I'll enjoy marriage far more. Ever been married before? Lay opened her mouth to retort. Please, Captain Dane, my Lady Lay. Jode interjected with a brilliant smile. If we have only a day's travel ahead of us, let us enjoy one another's company while we still can, yes? Lay and Dane mumbled apologies and returned to the gruel. Though the sun was still buried behind the clouds, it was just past dawn when they broke camp and headed back toward the old road, the path that connected the great cities of Breland. They'd chosen to sleep in a clearing well away from the road so Pierce could watch for enemies, but a tangle of the king's woods lay between the travelers and the road, and it was there that trouble struck. From behind a tree stepped a man out, a rangy, pock-faced Brelander, wearing the patched leather tunic of a Brelish soldier. Perhaps he was a deserter, or a retiree with nowhere to go, but Dane thought it just as likely the man had torn his ill-fitting armor from the corpse of its true owner. A grey woolen cloak shielded him from the rain, and he waved a wooden cudgel in their direction. Ho there, travelers! The man called, his voice a gravelly rasp. Dane stepped to the front of the group, signaling the others to halt. Morgalan's the name. By your dress, I take you to be strangers in our lovely land. Mourners, are you? Mourners? Asked Dane. Refuse from what's left of Sayre. They're calling it the Mournland now, on account of there being nothing for you. Lot to do, but mourn for what you lost. If you got a point, make it quick. Dane's hand went to his sword, but he held his temper in check. This was far from the first time they'd been harassed, and Dane smelled a trap. I have a bit of a nose for the energies of the arcane, and I can see that there's more to the young lady's backpack than meets the eye. I'll be taking that along with any coin you might have on you. 4-1 by my count. Not odds in your favor. Dane scratched the back of his neck, using the opportunity to make a few swift gestures to his companions with the tips of his fingers. Things are rarely what they seem. A crossbow bolt flew from the trees and struck the ground near Dane's feet. True, Dane said, but he was already in motion, charging at the highwaymen, drawing his sword and dagger as he ran. From the corner of his eye, Dane saw Pierce raise his enormous long bow and send 2 feathered arrows back along the path of the crossbow bolt. There was a cry from the woods, and the sound of a man falling from the trees. 2 men and a woman, all 3 dressed in tattered leathers and armed with hatchets, burst out of the woods on Dane's left. He slowed his charge long enough to be sure the others had them. Lay was waiting for them. She hurled a small stone in their direction. It burst with a blinding flare of golden radiance. As the bandits threw up their hands to shield their eyes, Pierce was already loosing more arrows. Within seconds, all three lay stretched out on the ground. Morgulon met Dane's charge head-on. With a furious cry and a blow of his cudgel, he knocked Dane's blade from his hand. But the sword was the lesser threat. Dane's dagger was Cannith forged from adamantine and could slice through steel with ease. Dane ducked beneath the bandit's next blow, and with one swift stroke, he cut the cudgel in two, leaving Morgulon with a bare stump of wood. Dropping the ruined remnant of his club and stepping back, the bandit made an intricate gesture with his left hand, while muttering words in a language Dane had never heard. Dane felt the touch of enchantment, and for a moment it was difficult to focus. Morgulon. Why were they fighting? After all, surely this was a misunderstanding. His friend, Morgulon, needed his help, needed his assistance against these three brutes. Dane had dealt with sorcerers before, and Sarath had occasionally tried a charm when he'd been ordered to dig latrines. Gritting his teeth, Dane shook his way free of the intrusive thoughts and drove his dagger into the shoulder of the bandit. Morgulon gasped, and the mystical pressure faded. Dane grabbed the man by his neck with his free hand, yanked the dagger free, and threw Morgulon into the mud. He leaned down, his foot on the bandit's neck and his blade at his throat. "Now, listen to me, Brillander," he growled. "I've been fighting your kind for 6 years. Every instinct I've got says I should slit your throat and leave you bleeding in the dirt." He struck the pale man across the face with the pommel of his dagger, slamming his face into the mud. "But the war's over, and I am a stranger in your land. Don't give me a reason to start fighting again." Dane stood up, deliberately cutting Morgulon's purse from his belt. He tossed the leather pouch to Lay and picked up his fallen sword. Across the way, Jode was tending to the wounds of the bandits Pierce had feathered, while the Warforged kept the injured ruffians covered with his massive bow. "Leave them be, Jode," Dane called. "We've got other business in this lovely land." There was little conversation following the attack, and they eventually joined the stream of travelers on the old road to Sharn. Jode rode on Pierce's shoulders, singing an occasional song in the liquid tongue of his distant homeland. Dane brought up the rear, watching Jode and wondering. After all the years they'd spent together, the many battles they'd been through, Jode was still an enigma to him. The halfling had come from the distant Talenta Plains, a barren land said to be home to huge lizards. The glittering dragon mark of his healing was spread across his bald head as plain as day, but Jode had never acknowledged any ties to House Jorasco, and he did not wear the signet ring of a dragonmark heir. He was always ready with a cheerful story or a song, but his own past was a mystery. Dane had never pushed him. He had pain enough in his own past, and if Jode had secrets, it wasn't Dane's place to steal them. Midday, the clouds cleared, and there it lay before them, Sharn, the city of towers. Even at this distance, the towers stretched up to the sky, dozens of shining spires, each bristling with minarets and turrets. The old road passed through flat farmlands, and over the course of the day, it seemed less as if they were moving and more as if the towers themselves were growing, rising up, higher and higher with every passing hour. Slowly, details emerged. Dane noticed that a few of the smaller towers seemed to be floating in the air, unconnected to the main columns. Tiny dots moved to and fro, Boats and other vessels darted through the air. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, the lights of the city became visible, twinkling like stars. House Canith lit the city, you know, Lay said. Casalon de Canith perfected cold fire almost 700 years ago. The impact on Galifar was truly remarkable. In many ways, it set the stage for... I thought the elves developed cold fire thousands of years ago, Dane said. Lay scowled. Yes, well, Canith brought it to Corvair. Dane smiled. Though Lay did not see it, the elves of Erenal had been working with magic for more than 3 times the length of recorded human history, and Dane had once met an Erenal ambassador who was over 700 years old. It was only natural that elven skills would exceed those of the younger race, but it was one of the only ways to derail Lay's effusive monologues about the virtues of her house. How do they keep the towers from falling? Asked Pierce. It was as much as he had said in the last week. The Warforged warrior, never talkative in the best of times, had become positively taciturn in recent months. Dane was hardly surprised. Pierce had been built to defend Seer, and now the country was destroyed, the war over. What purpose did Pierce serve in this broken world? So far, he'd continued to follow Dane's orders, but how long would this loyalty last? There are places in the world where arcane energies behave in an unusual manner, Lay said. Many sages believe that this is the result of other worlds touching this one. So a place touched by Dolor is filled with despair, while Lamania causes vegetation to bloom. Along these cliffs, spells of air and flight are empowered. The enchantments that support these towers could not be performed in most places. The city itself is drawn to the sky. You'll see flying boats and similar things, all the result of the magic of this place. So, if they're all supported by magic, what happens should the spells unravel? Dane's mind flashed back to the storm ship tumbling from the sky after Serath disrupted its bindings. Well, actually, I believe that towers have fallen in the past, during the war, presumed sabotage, though it was never proven. And I imagine your beloved lives in one of these highest towers? Yes. Dane didn't turn to look, but he could hear the frown in her voice. Wonderful. As the sun slipped below the cliffs, the old road came to the tower called Tavik's Landing, then ran beneath a vast bronze statue of Queen Rowan Ir-Wirnarn, her sword raised in defiance of the laws of Galifar. Black-cloaked guards manned a dozen separate gates, listening to the tales of merchants, travelers, and peasants. The traditions of a century of war were still in effect, and no one entered Sharn without passing the guardians of the gate. The gate to which Dane and his companions came was manned by a burly dwarf, whose beard resembled a patch of black thorns. "You don't look like you're from these parts," he growled. He studied Pierce, and then fixed on Dane's rank insignia. "Mourners, are ye? Serves you right, you ask me." He nodded up toward the statue of Rowan, the queen, whose rebellion had started the last war. "Stand against Breland, and see what it gets you." Jode stepped forward before Dane could speak. "I see that little escapes your keen eyes, Sergeant. I take it you've encountered mourners before, The dwarf studied him carefully. Jode's dragon mark was spread across the top of his head, and the dragon mark usually meant power and wealth. That's right. High walls is lousy with them. Used to be where they kept traitors. Some would say it still is. Again, Jode interjected before Dane could speak. Well, it's a simple mistake to make, but ours is no simple tale, sir. Yes, Lord Dane wears the dress of a Sharn soldier, but there is far more here than meets the eye. Allow me to introduce the Lady Lay, heir to the Mark of Making. Lay curtsied and extended her hand, revealing her Cannith signet ring. The dwarf examined the ring closely. Lady Lay is betrothed to Lord Hadron of Cannith, whose name I certainly hope you recognize. As any child could tell you, House Cannith had its seat of power in the confines of Seir. And after the disaster, Lord Hadran wished to ensure the safety of his beloved. Thus he hired the three of us. Lord Dane, a master swordsman trained by the blade mark of House Daneth. Pierce, a stalwart warforged warrior, handcrafted by my lady's parents to ensure the safety of their only daughter. And myself, Jode de Jurasco, a healer without equal. Minutes passed as Jode wove his tale, describing the great dangers the trio had faced in their hunt for the lost Cannith heir. The dwarf stood spellbound as Jode recounted the battle with the warped Warforged and the living darkness. A black-cloaked woman wearing the badge of a captain came over and rapped him on the side of his head, snapping him out of a daze. Horus, process this lot and move on. You're holding up the line. The dwarf blinked and shook his head to clear the cobwebs. Yes. Sorry. Just make a mark here on the ledger, and you can be on your way. I trust you're not bringing dangerous materials into the city. Pyrotechnics, dragon's blood, dream lily. I do have 3 warforged in my pack, they said. Is that a problem? Jode sighed. In your... May I see them, please, Lady Cannith? Lay took off her pack and unfolded the funnel-shaped cloth cone at the top. Pierce, do you mind? A murmur ran through the waiting crowd as the massive Warforged warrior crawled into the tiny backpack. A moment later, he emerged, dragging the battered body of a small Warforged scout. All 3 are inert, Lay explained. I haven't had time to see if they had been restored, but we found them during our travels, and I wanted to return them to the house. I see. Clearly, Cannith heirs transporting damaged Warforged were not a part of this guard's daily routine. You can go about your business, my lady. Enjoy your visit to Sharn. Lay smiled as Pierce pushed the wounded Warforged back into her extraordinary pack. Thank you, Sergeant, she said. I'm sure I will. Once they were safely out of earshot of the guards, Jode turned to Lay, shaking his head. Pierce and Dane were straggling behind, their eyes turned skyward to the towers, awnings, bridges, and buildings that stretched upward and out of sight. Lady Lay, said Jode, there really was no need to mention the Warforged at all. I had the situation well in hand. I've always wondered if you had formal ties to House Jurasco, Jode. Why don't you ever talk about it? I made that up, my lady. I had the sense that our sergeant would be more impressed by the emissaries of a powerful house as opposed to a few mourners in search of refuge. That would explain that bit about the fight with the cannibal children, she frowned. My parents were involved in the early work with the Warforged, though. It's entirely possible they did build Pierce. Jode shrugged. I was simply speaking extemporaneously, my lady. I had no idea my words held even one grain of truth. And Dane. Lay glanced back at Dane and Pierce, neither of whom were paying she and Jode the least bit of attention. He didn't actually train with House Deneth? I'm no oracle, Lady Lay. I was just spinning a tale for our prickly sergeant. Besides, can you really see our captain in a house of mercenaries? Lay smiled, then broke into laughter. After a moment, Jode began to laugh with her. Dane scowled as he and Pierce caught up to them. All right. You've had your fun. Now let's get on with it. I want to sleep in a bed tonight, and we still have to find your loving suitor, Lay. Follow me, Lord Dane. Still smiling, Lay led them through the crowd.